Which do you think looks better, with or without HDR, high dynamic range? So this is the Samsung 32-inch CHG70. It's got a Quad HD resolution, 144Hz refresh, and FreeSync 2. But the headline here is HDR, high dynamic range. Samsung are calling it the world's first HDR QLED gaming monitor, and for around £630 or $699, it could be yours. But before you make your mind up about an HDR monitor, let me run you through everything you need to know, because I'm not sure you should, at least not yet. The first mention of HDR in games was with Half-Life 2: The Lost Coast, but really it wasn't true high dynamic range, it was just a bloom lighting effect, which is actually the same thing that's still used in some recent games that claim to be sort of HDR, including Deus Ex Mankind Divided, not true high dynamic range. Currently, there's only a handful of true HDR games, including Battlefield 1, Mass Effect Andromeda, Hitman, and Shadow Warrior 2. And then to make matters even more confusing, cross-platform games like Rise of the Tomb Raider and Gears of War 4, which support HDR on the Xbox One S, but don't on the PC, which is really annoying. So what exactly is a high dynamic range monitor? Basically, it's just a normal one that has a 10 or in some cases 12-bit color panel and can reach certain levels of brightness and contrast. But that by itself doesn't make it HDR, it just means you have a monitor that can output a 10-bit color spectrum. You then need a source of HDR content, whether it's a games console, UHD Blu-ray player, or a Windows PC that's had the latest Creators Update, which added support for HDR. HDR's never really worked well on monitors as it's caused higher response times and input lag. But the good news is that now HDR on PC uses the graphics card to do all the HDR processing, so now you can get HDR monitors like this with the same response time and input lag that you get on any other monitor. And in order to get the best HDR experience, you'll also need an AMD card with this monitor, since it uses FreeSync 2 technology that makes it play nice with HDR while also reducing screen tearing and stuttering. Similarly, if you have an NVIDIA graphics card, you'll need a G-Sync HDR monitor for the best experience. But one of the most important factors for HDR is brightness. Most monitors produce around 300 nits, whereas this Samsung can produce up to 600. That's very bright for a monitor and decent for HDR, but compared to the latest 2017 TVs, it's still not quite up to the same level. LG's latest OLEDs offer up to 750 nits, whereas Samsung's QLEDs can produce a whopping 1500 to 2000 nits. But to make things even more confusing, there's also fake HDR out there. We have to be careful because some brands are kind of misleading us by saying that their monitors are HDR when they're actually not. For example, the Dell U2518D is being sold as an HDR monitor, but it's actually only got an 8-bit panel and has a maximum brightness of 350 nits, not up to the official HDR10 spec. So they're calling it Dell HDR, which is basically using simulated software-based HDR that adjusts the brightness and contrast a little bit. Dell aren't the only ones doing this, but some brands are being a bit quick to jump on the HDR marketing bandwagon and making it harder for us consumers to know what's real and what's fake. So to avoid buying a fake one, just make sure you read a couple of reviews on it and check that in the technical specs, it specifically says it's capable of HDR10 or Dolby Vision HDR. So when it does work, you'll see richer colors, brighter whites, and deeper blacks, and as it says on the tin, basically a greater dynamic range of colors and contrast. The idea of HDR is that it preserves a lot of detail in the highlights and the shadows that you would otherwise not see in an image. But how good it looks also depends on what you're watching or playing. Battlefield 1 here, or Mass Effect, as you can see, have a significantly different look in HDR because they've been optimized for it. They've got the developers, the color artists, have created proper HDR color profiles. So it can give you a more vibrant gaming experience, and I would argue that HDR is a bigger deal than 4K because unlike going for the high resolution, it doesn't really have any additional impact on performance. There's a little bit of extra rendering that the GPU has to do, and it does come down to how well the game is developed and optimized, but most of the time you won't notice any major impact on your frame rate, unlike going to 4K. But the problem is, while you may initially think that the HDR image looks better because it's got higher contrast and deeper blacks, the higher exposure causes bright areas and highlights like the sun to be blown out. It's the same for the shadows, which can become too dark, so you simply can't see as much detail. I recorded Battlefield 1 with and without, as you can see, and while I would initially say this looks better, especially around the ground, it looks almost washed out without it. You can then see actually that if I skip forward a little bit, the sun is, well, look at that, it's completely blown out, whereas you get a lot more actual sort of information here. So while high dynamic range is supposed to give you a better range of detail and colors and brightness, it's almost as if we're getting an exaggerated bloom effect. And this isn't just because I've recorded it and that's what GeForce Now is doing. This is what I saw in game as well. So it seems to be a little bit inconsistent. And as I say, it does come down to how the color artists have created the profiles for the games. So it's not going to be the same for everything, but obviously looking at the gun, that looks nicer. But because it's so dark, so deep, the blacks, you basically can't see as much. And again, that applies to the whites as well. You're losing not detail necessarily, but it's getting so blown out, especially the highlights here, that actually, upon further inspection, it may not be a better image in some cases. So that's PC games, but what about HDR console games? Since there are so few PC games that support HDR, you could always hook up your PS4 Pro, your PS4, your Xbox One S or One X and play HDR games like Uncharted The Lost Legacy or Horizon Zero Dawn, Resident Evil 7, Gears of War 4, Gran Turismo Sport and Hitman, just to name a few. Of course, not every console game does support HDR. It's still a fairly short list, but there are definitely more than on the PC right now. And crucially, devs seem to be supporting it more because there are more 4K HDR TVs and they're becoming more mainstream. And this leads me to a larger point. With all the issues around HDR PC monitors, the price and the drivers and the game optimizations, isn't it just easier to play your PC HDR games on a big fancy HDR TV, which chances are you're more likely to have or will be buying soon? They're bigger, brighter, support more HDR formats, and pretty much all HDR TVs are 4K as well, so you have that option, assuming your PC is powerful enough. Although of course, downsides are the slightly higher input lag and response time, and of course also you do tend to sit further away, which can make using the desktop a bit annoying. But then again, you could just start a game and then connect up a wireless Xbox One controller, sit back on your sofa and relax in front of your big 4K HDR TV. I am a big fan of HDR. I think it can really enhance the vibrancy of a game and it works great on consoles. But with PC, there's just so many hurdles. One, you have to make sure you actually get a true 10-bit monitor. Two, you've got to make sure that the games you want to play actually support HDR, as right now there's only a handful. Number three, since Microsoft added support for HDR in Windows after the last Creators Update, there has been still a lot of driver issues. When I go to enable HDR and advanced color sometimes on the desktop, I just get that washed out issue, which apparently is a bug. Number four, not all HDR is the same. In some games, HDR10 works best, others Dolby Vision, and even then, only some games actually give you that option. And finally, number five, in games like Mass Effect and Battlefield, the HDR is, as I say, kind of blowing out the image and you're losing a lot of the detail sometimes, so you may not even like or prefer the HDR picture. So where does that leave us? Should you buy a HDR monitor? Well, there's a few on the market now, but honestly, I'd say it's not worth it yet. It's still too early to invest. There's not enough games and there's too many issues, but as more monitors come out, more games are optimized, and driver support gets better, then it will be worth getting excited about. But for now, for the next 6 months, I will give HDR a miss on PC and maybe just focus on getting a good 4K HDR TV and a PS4 and Xbox, which you could always hook up your PC to anyway. But at the same time, this is still a terrific monitor, and if you don't want to use HDR, you can just turn it off and not use it. But of course, you are paying a premium to get that feature, and also drastically reducing the choice of monitors that you get if you are looking for one with HDR right now. So I really hope you found that useful. Give me a thumbs up and click that subscribe button if you enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think of HDR PC gaming in the comments. And if anyone's counted how many times I've actually said the words HDR and monitor in this video, I'd be impressed. I bet it's like 50 or something. And also I know that I say HDR and monitor weirdly, so I get that all the time. So you don't have to let me know. I realize I said that weird. Anyway, hope that's been helpful. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time right here on the Tech Chat.